My name is Nora Whitaker and I am 35 years old. 7 months ago, my sister stood on my front porch in the rain with mascara on her cheeks and a suitcase at her feet, and for one full second I did not recognize her. Not because she looked different. Because I had spent 8 years teaching myself not to imagine her on my doorstep. Behind her, in the driveway, my mother's car was still running. My mother was in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield like if she didn't turn her head, she could pretend she wasn't part of what was happening. My father was driving. Both hands on the wheel. Face set. The posture of a man who had spent his entire life mistaking silence for dignity. My sister looked at me and said the first words we'd exchanged in almost 3 years. He's gone. That was it. No hello. No apology. No easing into it. Just 2 words carrying 8 years of fallout. He is gone. The man she took from me. The man my parents defended. The man they folded into holidays and family photos as if he had always belonged there and I had simply misread the story. The man I was told I needed to get over, because life is complicated and feelings happen and families survive things like this if people are mature. He was gone. I looked past my sister to the car in the driveway and saw my mother's face finally turn toward the house. I could feel the expectation from 50 feet away. Not spoken. Just hanging there. Open the door, Nora. Be the reasonable one, Nora. Be who you've always been. That's the thing about certain family roles. Even after years of distance, they still expect you to step right back into character the second they need the scene to move forward. Before we get into this, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. I need to take you back before I tell you whether I opened that door. Because that moment on the porch did not begin with rain and mascara and one suitcase. It began 30 years earlier, in a house outside Des Moines, Iowa, where there were 2 daughters and only one of them ever seemed to count at full volume. My sister, Ava, is 3 years older than me. She came into the world already knowing how to tilt it toward herself. She wasn't evil. She wasn't even difficult, not in the obvious sense. She was just the kind of child adults describe as magnetic. The kind who learned early that attention was a currency and then got very good at spending it. Teachers loved her. Neighbors remembered her. Cashiers at grocery stores complimented her hair and asked if she was in pageants. My parents, Richard and Elaine Whitaker, adored her in the way people adore what reflects well on them. My mother especially. Ava was beautiful, emotional, expressive, social. My mother used to say she filled a room. She meant it as praise. What she didn't say, but what I understood very young, was that there wasn't much room left after Ava filled it. I was the quiet one. The organized one. The child who remembered permission slips, packed her own lunch by 7th grade, and never once had to be told to do homework. In another family that might have earned trust, or closeness, or some form of recognition. In ours, it earned efficiency. I was easy. Which meant I became optional. There is a difference between being unloved and being unchosen. The first is loud. The second is subtle enough to make you doubt your own memory. A small example. 6th grade. I won the district writing competition. First place. They announced it at a ceremony on a Wednesday night. I brought home the invitation, put it on the kitchen counter, reminded my parents twice. That same week Ava had a regional dance showcase. One guess where my parents went. When I got home with the certificate rolled under my arm, my mother kissed the top of my head and said, "I'm sorry, honey, but Ava was counting on us." Ava was always counting on them. And eventually, I learned not to. By the time I reached high school, the roles had hardened into something nobody in my family needed to discuss because everyone was already performing them perfectly. Ava was the star. I was the support beam. Ava got rides, wardrobe money, soft landings, second chances, and emotional weather systems built around her needs. I got praised for being independent, which sounds nice until you realize, independent is what some parents call a child they've quietly stopped parenting. I wasn't bitter yet. Not then. I was too busy building a life inside my own head. I liked structure. Lists. Books. Plans. I liked things that held their shape. I think that happens when you grow up in a house where your place in it feels negotiable. You find stability where you can. Mine was school. I was good at it. Not flashy good. Not the kind of good that gets applause at dinner. Just consistent, serious, top-of-the-class good. I liked writing best. By 16 I knew I wanted a career that used language and logic together. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but I knew I wanted a life where clear thinking mattered. Ava, meanwhile, lived in a constant orbit of excitement and collapse. New friends. New dramas. New boyfriends. New heartbreaks. Every month brought a fresh emergency, and every emergency reorganized the house around her. My mother would sit on the edge of Ava's bed for hours talking through some social crisis while I microwaved my own dinner and did calculus homework at the kitchen table. Again, not abuse. Not on paper. But paper misses a lot. Ava moved out at 19, moved back at 21, moved out again at 22. Every time she returned, my parents treated her like weather. Unpredictable, disruptive, but beyond criticism. You adjusted to weather. You didn't ask it to be different. I left for college at 18 and stayed gone. Not dramatically. Not in a fight. I just left for the University of Iowa with a scholarship and a dorm assignment and the clear understanding that if I wanted an actual life, I would have to build it away from home. College was the first place I understood what it felt like to be seen in real time. Professors knew my name. Friends asked questions and waited for the answers. I was not the quiet second daughter there. I was Nora. Just Nora. It was such a simple thing, and it changed me completely. I studied communications and legal writing. I interned at a nonprofit legal center one summer and then at a family law office the next, where I discovered I had a skill for hearing what people meant even when they were lying about what they wanted. Family systems do that to you. If you grow up around people who say one thing and act another way, you become fluent in subtext. By 24 I was working full-time as a legal case manager in Chicago. I had a one-bedroom apartment with thin walls and terrible heating, a second-hand couch, and exactly enough money to feel tired all the time but proud of myself anyway. And that was where I met Ethan. He wasn't remarkable at first glance. That's probably part of why I trusted him. He wasn't polished in the artificial way some men are. He was warm, funny without trying too hard, the kind of person who listened with his whole face. He worked in commercial real estate development and had this habit of leaning in when you talked, like what you were saying had already become the most interesting thing in the room. We met through mutual friends at a birthday dinner. 3 weeks later we had coffee. 3 months later he was sleeping over often enough that one of us finally said maybe we should stop pretending this was casual. It wasn't casual. For 4 years, Ethan was the steadiest relationship in my life. He knew my habits, my silences, the difference between when I was tired and when I was upset and didn't want to say so yet. He knew what growing up in my family had done to me without ever using it against me. At least that's what I believed. I brought him home for Thanksgiving in our 3rd year together. That was the beginning of the end. Looking back, I can see the moment the axis tilted. At the time, I just thought the weekend felt off. My parents were immediately charmed by Ethan. That, by itself, wasn't strange. Ethan was easy to like when he wanted to be. My father liked that he worked in development. My mother liked that he was attentive and polished enough to feel presentable. They asked him questions they had never asked me with the same level of interest, about his work, his ambitions, his opinions on housing and city growth and the market. I told myself it didn't bother me. It did, a little. But I had spent most of my life smoothing down little hurts before they became visible. Ava was also there. She had moved back home again 2 months earlier after yet another breakup, this one with a man my mother had referred to as promising, for nearly a year, right up until he apparently stopped being promising and became, in retrospect, intimidated by strong women. My mother can rewrite history in under a minute if she thinks the right person needs protecting. Ava was 29 then. Beautiful in a polished, expensive way she couldn't actually afford without help. She had that low, intimate style of talking that makes men feel chosen. She had become even better at reading a room and inserting herself exactly where attention was beginning to settle elsewhere. She loved Ethan immediately. Or rather, she loved the effect Ethan had in the room. She loved that my parents liked him. She loved that he listened to her stories with patience. She loved, I think, the fact that he was attached to me and therefore unavailable in the way unavailable things become more interesting to people like my sister. It started with small things. Too small to name without sounding paranoid. She'd sit next to him instead of across from him. She'd ask him to help carry something from the garage when my father was right there. She'd find reasons to mention old family stories that cast me as uptight and her as spontaneous. My mother would laugh at those stories and say, "Nora was always so serious. Always so serious." As if seriousness were a flaw I had stubbornly chosen rather than the shape a child takes when the room is full and she doesn't want to take up too much of it. I mentioned it to Ethan on the drive back to Chicago. Not dramatically. More like I was testing my own perception aloud. "I think Ava was flirting with you." He laughed. "Your sister flirts with everyone. That isn't exactly reassuring." He glanced at me then, serious. "Nora. I'm with you." I believed him. Not because I was naive. Because when you have spent your life not being chosen, and someone chooses you repeatedly over years, you start to let that choice feel real. That Christmas we went back again. That was my mistake. Or maybe not mistake. Maybe just trust in the wrong direction. The same pattern repeated, only bolder. Ava started texting Ethan about housing questions because of his work. My mother mentioned casually that Ava and Ethan had ended up talking for an hour after I'd gone to bed one night over Thanksgiving because they just have such easy chemistry. That sentence landed and stayed lodged. I asked Ethan directly after we got back to Chicago if he was texting her. He said yes, but it was harmless. He showed me the messages. Most of them were harmless. A little too familiar maybe, but defensible. I didn't like them. He said he understood. He said he'd put distance there. He said again, "I'm with you." And again, I believed him. What I didn't understand yet was that my sister had never actually wanted Ethan as a person. She wanted what it meant to take something that had finally, unmistakably, been mine. This is the part people oversimplify when they hear stories like this. They assume it's about love or lust or chemistry. Sometimes it is. In our case it was about hierarchy. About proof. About whether I would ever be allowed to have something in that family without Ava eventually leaning over and taking a bite out of it. The real betrayal didn't happen in one moment. It happened across weeks of tiny permissions. A text answered. A boundary softened. A suspicion dismissed. A mother who saw what was happening and found it flattering instead of alarming. Then spring came. And with it, the weekend that blew everything open. My parents owned a small lake cottage 2 hours outside Des Moines. Owned is generous, actually. My grandfather had built it, and by the time it passed down to my parents it was more memory than property, drafty, dated, too much maintenance for what it was worth. But my mother loved it because family history makes ordinary places feel grander than they are, and every spring she insisted on one weekend out there to open the season. That year she wanted all of us there. I almost said no. I had a deadline at work, and Ethan had a project in Milwaukee on Monday morning, and the drive made no sense for one weekend. But my mother pressed, and my father called separately to say it would mean a lot, and I heard myself agreeing because some part of me was still trying to be the daughter who made things easy. By Saturday evening I knew I had made the wrong call. Ava had been drinking since lunch. Not sloppy. Just loose enough to become louder, more theatrical, more openly competitive. She kept pulling Ethan into conversations, interrupting me mid-sentence to redirect him toward her stories. Touching his arm in ways that would have been deniable if they hadn't been so consistent. I watched my mother watch this. That mattered most. More than Ava, even. Ava had always crossed lines if nobody stopped her. My mother was the person who could have named it, shut it down, restored the shape of the room. She didn't. She smiled. Once, when Ava and Ethan came back from the dock carrying a cooler together, my mother actually gave me a look I can only describe as amused. Like I was being too serious if I noticed. After dinner I told Ethan I was going to bed. I had no energy left for pretending the evening felt normal. He said he'd come in after helping my dad stack some chairs on the porch. I woke up at 1:30 and he wasn't there. I got up. Walked down the narrow hallway of the cottage in bare feet. The house was dark except for the light over the kitchen sink and the sliding glass door open to the screened porch. They weren't on the porch. I stepped outside and saw them on the dock. Not just talking. Not standing too close. Not anything deniable. Kissing. There are moments that split your life into before and after. That's one of mine. Not because of what I saw, people survive infidelity every day. But because of what happened next. Because of what the people around it chose to do with it. Ethan saw me first. He stepped back immediately. Ava turned and looked at me with an expression I still remember clearly because it held no shame at all. Just annoyance at being interrupted. "What the hell is this?" I asked. Ethan started toward me. "Nora, wait." "No. You don't get to tell me to wait." Ava wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and said, with incredible calm, "It wasn't planned." That sentence. As if spontaneous betrayal were somehow morally superior to intentional betrayal. I walked back to the house. My father was standing in the kitchen in his socks, clearly awake enough to know something had happened. My mother came out of the guest room behind him, robe tied tight, eyes moving from my face to the dock to the open door. I said, "They're out there together." My mother looked at me for one beat too long and then said, "Let's not make this bigger than it is until everyone has calmed down." That was the moment. More than the dock. More than the kiss. Let's not make this bigger than it is. My boyfriend was on the dock with my sister and my mother's first instinct was not shock, not anger, not protection. It was management. Optics. Damage control. By morning the story had already been rearranged. Ethan said he and I had been drifting. Ava cried and said she never meant to hurt me. My mother said feelings are messy and people don't choose them. My father said very little, which in our house usually meant he was siding with the person causing harm because silence was the cheapest way to do it. Then my mother said the sentence that finished whatever was left of us in that room. "You can't expect us to punish Ava for falling in love." Falling in love. They took a moment of betrayal and upgraded it into a romance before breakfast. I left that morning. I packed my bag, threw my shoes in the trunk, and drove back to Chicago on 3 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline. Ethan called 12 times. Ava texted twice. My mother left a voicemail that began, "Please don't be dramatic." I did not answer any of them. Not that day. Not that week. Not when Ethan showed up at my apartment with flowers like clichés become less insulting if they have fresh stems. Not when my father called and said my mother was heartbroken over how ugly this had all become. Ugly. As if I were the one who had ruined something beautiful. The next 6 months told me everything I needed to know about my family. At first I thought there might be room for truth. A narrow one, maybe, but room. I thought once the shock wore off my parents would see it for what it was. That there would be a line, somewhere, even in their loyalty to Ava. There wasn't. By June, Ethan was openly seeing my sister. By July, my mother was referring to him as being around more. By August, there were photos on Facebook from a family barbecue in my parents' backyard with Ethan standing between Ava and my father holding a plate and smiling like he'd always belonged there. I wasn't in the photos. I wasn't invited to the barbecue. I learned about it from a tagged post sent by a college friend who texted, "Please tell me this isn't what it looks like." It was exactly what it looked like. I made one attempt, one real, honest attempt, to speak to my parents before I let the whole thing go. I drove to West Hartford in September and sat at their kitchen table. The same table where homework had been done, where Patrick had announced his engagement, where Meg had cried over breakups that apparently ranked above my graduation and my relationship and anything else in the house that required adult attention. My mother made coffee. My father sat across from me. I said, very calmly, "I need to understand whether you see what happened as betrayal." My mother exhaled like I'd already exhausted her. My father stared into his mug. Then my mother said, "I think what happened was painful, but I think you're refusing to accept that feelings changed." Feelings changed. No accountability. No line. No naming. I said, "He was my partner for 4 years." She nodded. "And now he isn't." That was the entire moral framework. Reality had changed, therefore everyone's obligation was to adjust to the new reality as quickly and quietly as possible. I looked at my father and said, "Do you have anything to say?" He took a long time. Then, "I think your mother is right that fighting this won't change it." I almost laughed. Fighting what? My sister sleeping with my partner? My parents letting him take my seat in the family without consequence? I stood up. Put my coffee untouched beside the sink. Picked up my keys. And I said something I had never said to them before. "You picked her. Again. You always do. I just needed to hear you do it out loud." My mother said my name the way people do when they think the scene is getting away from them. I didn't stop. I left. I drove back to Chicago. I changed my phone settings so their calls went silent. Not blocked. Just silent. I didn't want the drama of blocking. I wanted distance. That fall, I started therapy. Not because of Ethan. Or not only because of Ethan. Therapy was about what the doc had exposed more than what it had caused. It exposed the old structure. The one I had spent my life working around so smoothly that I had almost convinced myself it wasn't there anymore. My therapist, Dana, listened to the whole story over 2 sessions without interrupting much. At the end of the second session she said, "You keep telling this story as if the betrayal began at the lake." It didn't. That was just the first time the pattern got loud enough that you couldn't reinterpret it. She was right. The pattern had been running for decades. The lake just removed the plausible deniability. That year I got promoted. Then 6 months later I left my firm for a better position at a family law practice downtown. Better pay. Better hours. Sharper work. I built a life that was deliberate and strong and increasingly peaceful. I stopped checking their social media. Stopped asking mutual relatives for updates. Stopped holding my breath for a phone call that would contain actual accountability. I wasn't punishing them. I was done auditioning for people who had already cast the part. He took a long time. Then, "I think your mother is right that fighting this won't change it." I almost laughed. Fighting what? My sister sleeping with my partner? My parents letting him take my seat in the family without consequence? I stood up. Put my coffee untouched beside the sink. Picked up my keys. And I said something I had never said to them before. "You picked her. Again. You always do. I just needed to hear you do it out loud." My mother said my name the way people do when they think the scene is getting away from them. I didn't stop. I left. I drove back to Chicago. I changed my phone settings so their calls went silent. Not blocked. Just silent. I didn't want the drama of blocking. I wanted distance. That fall, I started therapy. Not because of Ethan. Or not only because of Ethan. Therapy was about what the doc had exposed more than what it had caused. It exposed the old structure. The one I had spent my life working around so smoothly that I had almost convinced myself it wasn't there anymore. My therapist, Dana, listened to the whole story over 2 sessions without interrupting much. At the end of the second session she said, "You keep telling this story as if the betrayal began at the lake." It didn't. That was just the first time the pattern got loud enough that you couldn't reinterpret it. She was right. The pattern had been running for decades. The lake just removed the plausible deniability. That year I got promoted. Then 6 months later I left my firm for a better position at a family law practice downtown. Better pay. Better hours. Sharper work. I built a life that was deliberate and strong and increasingly peaceful. I stopped checking their social media. Stopped asking mutual relatives for updates. Stopped holding my breath for a phone call that would contain actual accountability. I wasn't punishing them. I was done auditioning for people who had already cast the part. If you've ever had to become your own family because the one you were born into kept choosing someone else, drop a fire emoji in the comments. Time moved. That's what it does even when your emotional life feels stalled in one room. Ava married Ethan 18 months after the lake weekend. My mother mailed me the invitation. White cardstock. My name written carefully in the center, as if the neatness of her handwriting made the invitation less obscene. I threw it away unopened after I saw the return address. My father called once the week before the wedding and left a voicemail that began, "We would really like you there." Not because he thought I should be celebrated. Because my absence would be visible. My father had spent his whole life believing that what people saw mattered more than what was true, and my empty chair at that wedding would have looked like exactly what it was. I did not go. I took myself to dinner that night instead. A steakhouse in Chicago with white tablecloths and low light and a bartender who noticed I was dressed too well to be alone accidentally and too still to be celebrating anything simple. He poured me a second glass of wine and didn't make me talk. I appreciated that. The years after their wedding were strange mostly because they were so ordinary from a distance. Ava and Ethan bought a house in Des Moines. My parents adored hosting them. There were holiday photos. Matching sweaters one year. Backyard grill photos another. My mother sent Christmas cards with all of them smiling in front of fireplaces and porches, and some part of me had to acknowledge that if you didn't know the backstory, it looked like a perfectly normal family. That's what made it worse, in some ways. Not the betrayal. The editing. I built my own life in the meantime with increasing success and decreasing emotional noise. I made senior associate at the family law firm, then partner at 33. I bought a larger condo with actual light and a balcony I used in the spring. I adopted another dog after my first one died too young and named her June. I got better at being happy without imagining a future witness for it. I dated. Some of it was good. One man almost mattered. It didn't work out, but not in a dramatic way. Just one of those adult endings where 2 decent people want different shapes of life. I handled it well. That mattered to me more than whether it lasted. And then, sometime in my mid-30s, the thing I had not expected happened. My parents started reaching for me. Not dramatically. Not with apologies. More like people testing whether a frozen pipe is thawing by turning the tap a little. My father called more often. My mother started asking questions about my work that suggested she had been paying closer attention than I'd given her credit for. When my grandmother died, my mother cried in the parking lot after the funeral and said, "I know we've lost years with you." It wasn't enough. But it was movement. I did not rush to meet it. I let it be exactly what it was, late, incomplete, but real enough to notice. That was when I learned something about adult estrangement that I wish more people said out loud. Reconnection rarely begins with the apology you spent years scripting in your head. It begins smaller, clumsier, less satisfying. A phone call. A question. A sentence that almost says the thing. If you're waiting for language elegant enough to fix everything, you can miss the fact that someone is trying in the only language they have. I didn't trust it yet. But I noticed it. Meanwhile, Ava's life was developing cracks. Not visible ones at first. Small ones. Ethan changed jobs twice in 2 years. There were rumors he'd been traveling too much, then not enough, then working on a startup idea, which is the kind of phrase that means either someone is about to become rich or become impossible to live with. My mother would mention these things in passing like weather reports. They're under stress. Marriage is hard. You know how men get when work is uncertain. I know how certain men get when uncertainty hits. They reach for validation where it's easiest. That pattern had never been theoretical to me. But I said nothing. Because some lessons people insist on learning in their original language. The first real sign that things were falling apart came through my father. He called on a Sunday afternoon in early spring and, after the usual preamble about weather and work, he said, "Ava and Ethan are having a hard time." I remember this clearly because it was the first time my father had ever raised Ava's life in conversation with me in a tone that was not asking for sympathy or management or alliance. He was just tired. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." He was quiet for a second. Then, "I don't think she tells us everything." That sentence mattered more than he probably knew. For most of my life, my parents had treated Ava's version of events as fact. Not because they were foolish. Because it was easier. Ava's narratives were emotionally expensive and accepting them without scrutiny was the cheapest available path. My father saying "I don't think she tells us everything" was, in our family, close to a seismic event. I said, "Maybe she's embarrassed." He said, "Maybe." That was all. But it sat with me. 2 months later, my mother called me from a grocery store parking lot. I could hear the echo of the car and the shakiness in her breath. "Ethan moved out for a few days," she said. I leaned against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. Not from satisfaction. From recognition. "He says he needs space." My mother's voice carried that old familiar plea tucked inside the information. "Help me understand this. Help me fix this. Help me hold the emotional weight of your sister's life again." I said, "Do they want counseling?" "He won't go." I almost said, "That's because he already knows what he's doing." But I didn't. Some truths need to arrive under their own power. A week later, Ethan came back. Then he left again. Then came back. Then left for good. Which brings us to the Tuesday in October. 11:30. Rain. Suitcase. Mascara. My mother in the car pretending not to look. When Ava said, "He's gone," I looked at her for a long moment. She looked wrecked, yes, but more than that she looked disoriented. Like someone who had spent her entire life assuming gravity would bend in her favor and had just discovered that floors can disappear. "What do you want from me?" I asked. She flinched. Honest question. Clean question. No cushioning. I didn't know where else to go. That was almost enough to make me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was too exact. My sister, who had spent half a lifetime moving toward whatever room was easiest, now standing at my door because ease had finally run out everywhere else. Behind her, my mother's car engine was still idling. I looked toward it and raised one hand in a small gesture, "Kill the engine or leave." My father turned the key. The engine stopped. That mattered. I stepped back from the doorway. Just once. Not wide. Not welcoming. Just enough. Ava dragged the suitcase in. June, my dog, came out of the hallway, assessed the emotional climate immediately, and stationed herself between us like a furry neutral observer. Ava stood in my foyer dripping onto the tile and said, "He left a note." I said, "Of course he did." She started crying again. Harder this time. Not theatrically. Broken, exhausted crying. The kind that comes when the last story you've been telling yourself finally collapses. I handed her a towel. Not because she deserved softness. Because my floors are hardwood. That sounds cold. Maybe it was. But truthfully, I wasn't feeling cold. I was feeling something more dangerous than that. I was feeling clear. And clarity, in families like mine, can look a lot like cruelty to the people who have benefited from your confusion. I made tea. Not because tea fixes anything, but because in every serious conversation I have ever had in my adult life, putting something in a mug and placing it between two people gives the room structure. Ava sat at my kitchen table wrapped in one of my old gray cardigans, hair damp from the towel, eyes red. I sat across from her. June lay under the table with her chin on my foot. For a while, she just talked. Not in a straight line. More like someone emptying a drawer onto the floor and trying to identify what matters after everything is already in a heap. Ethan had been seeing someone for 7 months. He'd told her it started after things got bad. He'd moved money from their joint account into a separate business account she didn't know existed. The startup idea wasn't really a startup. It was a sequence of bad investments and one very convenient lie. He had left a note on the kitchen island that said he needed a different life. A different life. I sat there listening to the woman who had once taken my life apart with a kiss on a dock now explain the note left on her own kitchen island by the same man. When she ran out of details, she looked up at me and asked the question I had known was coming. Did you always think this would happen? I considered lying. Something generous and evasive. But the night had gone too far for anything except truth. Yes, I said. Not the exact shape. But the direction? Yes. She looked like I'd slapped her. Maybe I had, a little. But only with honesty. And honesty was long overdue in that family. She stared into her tea for a while. Then she said, I hated you. Not the sentence I expected. Not first. I said nothing. She kept her eyes on the mug. When you brought him home that Thanksgiving, I hated how he looked at you. I hated how calm you were around him. I hated that you had something settled. Something real. I was living back in Mom and Dad's house again and everyone was pretending I was fine and I wasn't fine and you walked in with this life that looked solid. And I couldn't stand it. There it was. Not love. Not fate. Not messy feelings no one could help. Envy. Competition. Hunger. The old family hierarchy turning one last violent screw. I said, very quietly, so you took him. She nodded once. Tiny. Ashamed now in a way she had not been at 30. Timing matters. Humility often arrives only after consequence. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence work. My parents knocked an hour later. Not rang the bell. Knocked. Carefully. Which told me they understood they were not entering their usual role tonight without permission. I opened the door. My mother's face was streaked with old tears and fresh worry. My father looked older than he had looked in the car. The past 8 years had not been easy on any of them, and the last 6 months had apparently accelerated that. My mother started with, "How is she?" I said, "Inside." Then I added, before either of them could move, "We're not doing this the old way." That stopped everyone. My father nodded first. Not defensively. Just once, like he was accepting terms before hearing them. My mother looked confused and tired enough that confusion was probably the best she could manage. I stepped aside and let them in. We all sat in the kitchen. No one talked for a full minute. Then my father did something I had not expected in 1,000 possible versions of that night. He looked at Ava and said, "Did you take him from your sister because you wanted him, or because she had him?" It was the first clean question anyone in my family had ever asked in the middle of a crisis. No management. No protection. No rearranging. Ava didn't answer right away. Then, both, at first. Mostly the second. My mother made a sound under her breath. Not denial. Not outrage. More like the sound a person makes when the lie they have been preserving finally becomes too tired to stand. I looked at my parents and said, "Do you understand now? It was never just about him. It was about all of you deciding that whatever belonged to me could become hers if it made her feel better. No one interrupted. That silence was worth more than the apology I still hadn't heard. My parents left around 1:30 in the morning. Ava stayed in my guest room because I was not going to put a crying woman with nowhere to go back in the car, no matter how much history sat between us. Compassion and reconciliation are not the same thing. I have learned that very carefully. The next morning my mother called before breakfast. "Nora," she said, voice raw from too little sleep, "your father and I need to talk to you. Properly. Not through this." I said, "Then talk." There was a pause. Then she said, "Can we come over tonight?" I almost refused. The old instinct, don't go back in, don't give them the room to explain away the truth they finally had to look at. But this wasn't the old situation anymore. The old situation depended on my silence. I was done funding it. So I said yes. They came at 6. My father held a bakery box neither of us touched. My mother sat on my couch like she had been lowered into it by machinery. My father began, which surprised me. My mother usually led emotional negotiations because she preferred the illusion of softness. My father had spent most of his life outsourcing emotional language to her. He said, "We chose what was easiest to manage." That was the truth of it. Ava made noise. "You absorbed impact. We let that become the system. And when the thing with Ethan happened, we did what we'd always done. We moved toward the child who was harder to contain. No protection. No rearranging." Ava didn't answer right away. Then, both, at first. Mostly the second. My mother made a sound under her breath. Not denial. Not outrage. More like the sound a person makes when the lie they have been preserving finally becomes too tired to stand. I looked at my parents and said, "Do you understand now? It was never just about him. It was about all of you deciding that whatever belonged to me could become hers if it made her feel better." No one interrupted. That silence was worth more than the apology I still hadn't heard. My parents left around 1:30 in the morning. Ava stayed in my guest room because I was not going to put a crying woman with nowhere to go back in the car, no matter how much history sat between us. Compassion and reconciliation are not the same thing. I have learned that very carefully. The next morning my mother called before breakfast. "Nora," she said, voice raw from too little sleep, "Your father and I need to talk to you. Properly. Not through this." I said, "Then talk." There was a pause. Then she said, "Can we come over tonight?" I almost refused. The old instinct, don't go back in, don't give them the room to explain away the truth they finally had to look at. But this wasn't the old situation anymore. The old situation depended on my silence. I was done funding it. So I said yes. They came at 6. My father held a bakery box neither of us touched. My mother sat on my couch like she had been lowered into it by machinery. My father began, which surprised me. My mother usually led emotional negotiations because she preferred the illusion of softness. My father had spent most of his life outsourcing emotional language to her. He said, "We chose what was easiest to manage." That was the truth of it. Ava made noise. "You absorbed impact. We let that become the system. And when the thing with Ethan happened, we did what we'd always done. We moved toward the child who was harder to contain." Trust is not a curtain you pull open because somebody finally says the right words. It's masonry. Brick by brick. Repetition. Time. Watching whether the next choice matches the previous sentence. So I watched. My mother called and asked before visiting. My father called me directly to ask about work and stayed on the subject of my life for once. Ava did not ask for more money. Did not ask for more rescuing. Did not try to turn me into her emergency contact for every emotional inconvenience. She got a second job, cut expenses, and for the first time in her life began learning what consequence feels like when no one cushions it for you. I watched all of it. And I did not rush to forgive because rushing is just another way of abandoning yourself for peace. It's been 7 months since Ava stood on my porch in the rain and said, "He's gone." A lot can happen in 7 months. Not everything. But enough to change the shape of things. My relationship with my parents is not fixed. I don't use that word because fixed suggests we have returned to some healthy original form, and the original form was never healthy. What we have now is something else. More honest. Smaller. Less sentimental. Better. My mother speaks to me differently now. More carefully, yes, but not in the artificial way of someone trying to perform correctness. She listens. Actually listens. Which, if you've lived your whole life being the child who got half attention, feels almost supernatural the first few times it happens. My father shows up. Literally. He drove to Chicago in January just to take me to lunch and see my office. No occasion. No emergency. No Ava-centered reason. He just wanted to come. He sat in a booth across from me, looked around the restaurant, and said, "You built a good life." Not flashy. Not poetic. But real. I knew by then how much effort real costs him. Ava and I are the hardest part to explain because sisterhood after betrayal is not one thing. It isn't hatred forever. It isn't easy forgiveness either. It's stranger than that. More uneven. Some days she feels like someone I could one day know honestly. Other days I look at her and see the doc and the cardigan and the sentence, mostly the second, and I think maybe some relationships don't come back as what they were. Maybe they come back, if they come back at all, as something entirely new. She is different now. Less polished. Less certain. More real, maybe. Pain does that if you let it. It strips performance when performance stops working. A month ago she came over for dinner. Just her. No parents. We ate takeout on my couch because I had worked late and neither of us felt like pretending adulthood always looks organized. At one point she looked around my living room, the books, the dog bed, the framed photos, the calm of it, and said, "I used to think you were lucky because you felt so solid. Now I know you built it." That line stayed with me. Because that's what my whole life was, really. Watching other people assume my steadiness came naturally while never seeing the labor under it. The hours. The restraint. The private rebuilding. The years of becoming the kind of person who could hold her own life up without applause. My parents chose my sister over me my whole life. That sentence is true. It is also true that people can arrive late to their own understanding. My parents did. My sister did. I did too, in some ways. I spent a long time believing that being overlooked meant being less valuable. It took me years to understand that the opposite was true. I was overlooked because I was already carrying weight nobody wanted to notice. Strength, when it appears early, gets mistaken for not needing care. But strength is not the absence of need. It's what some people build because need went unanswered. So no, I did not slam the door in my sister's face that night. I opened it. Not for her. Not even really for my parents. For me. Because by the time she showed up, I had built a life strong enough that helping her didn't threaten it. I could afford compassion without confusing it for surrender. I could tell the truth without setting myself on fire to keep the room warm. I could let them all stand in what they had done without rescuing them from the sight of it. That was the real reversal. Not that Ethan left her. Men like that leave eventually. That's not revelation. That's pattern. The revelation was this: when the story finally turned, I was no longer the person they had left behind in it. My name is Nora Whitaker. I am 35 years old. My sister took the man I thought I was going to marry. My parents stood beside her while it happened and called it complicated. 8 years later, when he walked out on her, she came to my door because there was nowhere else to go that wasn't built on another lie. I opened the door. Not because she deserved it. Because I had become someone who gets to decide what mercy looks like. And this time, For once, the choice was mine.